1940. Fast-moving columns of tanks and lorry-borne infantry, supported by artillery and ground attack aircraft, smash frontier defences and strike deep into the heart of France.
France and the Low Countries fall in just 6 weeks to this new form of armoured warfare that will become called Blitzkrieg, lightning war, and legends are made.
Schneller Heinz Guderian as the apostle of armoured warfare, and Rommel with 7th Panzer Division, nicknamed Der Gespensterdivision, the Ghost Division, because not even the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht knew where they were.
How did this happen? How could the French army, one of the world's biggest and best equipped, supported by a British expeditionary force, be routed in such a short space of time?
The answer is the German army had eagerly adopted Blitzkrieg as a tactical theory. What's less well known is that it was in large part a British idea. This film is going to look at how these tactics reshaped the Second World War battlefield and the people and the vehicles involved.
The concept, German tactics called Wohnungskrieg or manoeuvre warfare, later renamed Blitzkrieg, which is obviously lightning war, actually have their origins pretty firmly in British Army experimentation in the use of armour on the battlefield back in the 1920s and 30s.
Combined arms tactics, the use of infantry, tanks, aircraft and artillery working together, had been pioneered by the British Army on the Western Front in World War I. In the interwar period, and taking in big improvements in tank and armoured fighting vehicle technology, British military theorists experimented with the use of armour, mechanisation and mobility on the future battlefield. The culmination of this was the forming of a trials unit, the Experimental Mechanised Force. These ideas, although influential, weren't fully followed through.
Swift and deadly, they are one of the most successful weapons of modern warfare.
They were, however, adopted with alacrity by the resurgent Wehrmacht. Even before the end of World War I, military thinkers like Lt Col JFC Fuller, Boney Fuller, we've got his papers here at the Tank Museum, had begun to think beyond the blood and stalemate of the trenches and to explore the possibilities of mechanisation and its use on the future battlefield. Even during the war, combined arms actions in battles like Cambrai and Amiens had proved successful. This was a good basis for development, but the problem was the British heavy tanks were too slow. This old lady, this is a Mark IV, is well armed. She's got twin 6-pounder guns, secondary Hotchkiss guns. But the trouble is, her top speed on the road is about 4 miles an hour, half that off-road. At Cambrai, the situation is the tanks create a big breach in the enemy's lines, but they are too slow and they have suffered too many casualties to exploit it. Conventional thinking was that cavalry, used as mounted infantry, could do the job, but did tanks like the British Whippet and the French Renault FT point the way? The Whippet medium tank seemed to show the possibility for lighter, faster tanks on the battlefield. This is our Whippet, Caesar II, and as you can see, she is armed with Hotchkiss guns and has a top speed of 8 miles an hour, which is easily more than double that of the heavy tanks. In action at Cashy in March 1918, 7 Whippets surprised and destroyed 2 German infantry battalions forming up for an attack. They inflicted over 400 casualties.
This video has been made possible by our supporters on Patreon, our YouTube members and our super thanks donors. Please join them if you can and support the Tank Museum. And thanks for watching.
Fuller's Plan 1919, drawn up in 1917 on the grounds that the war would continue just about indefinitely, envisaged the idea of rather than attritional warfare on a broad front, parties of tanks, troops and aircraft would raid behind the lines, disrupting command and control, the shot through the brain, as had been seen at Cashy. To quote Fuller,
every available bombing aircraft should concentrate on the various supply and road centres. The signals communication should not be destroyed, but it's important that the confusion resulting from the dual attack carried out by the medium D tanks and aeroplanes should be circulated by the enemy. Bad news confuses, confusion stimulates panic. Then, a carefully mounted artillery, tank and infantry attack should be launched, the objective of which is the zone of the enemy's guns, namely the secondary tactical zone, some 10,000 yards deep. So does an army depend for its power on the will of its commander and his staff. Cut that will off, and the army will be paralysed.
A new generation of tanks were on their way, tanks like the Mark V 2-star and the Mark 8. They're very similar in design and construction to the Mark IV we've already seen, but they're bigger and longer to cope better with terrain. This, the Mark V 2-star, is a stretch version of the Mark V, and it's got a 150 horsepower Ricardo engine that's been bored out to 230 horsepower. This is the Mark 8. It's also known as the International, from the intention that it would be manufactured in large numbers by Britain, the United States and France. It's a big tank. It weighs 38 tons, it's 10.4 metres long, and it's also something of a fortress. It's got 2 6-pounder guns, 7 Hotchkiss guns, and for the crew, it's got the advantage that they no longer sit around the engine. It's actually in a compartment in the back, which is a considerable advantage for them. The problem with it, though, is despite the fact it's got a 300 horsepower Ricardo engine, it's actually not even as fast as a Whippet. Top speed of 6 miles an hour. However, neither of these tanks would actually do what Fuller envisaged. His plan required large numbers of a new vehicle called the medium Mark D. And this would do 20 miles an hour, and that's an unheard of speed for a tracked vehicle of the period.
Unfortunately, at the time, it didn't exist as anything more than a concept, although work on it soon began, and mock-ups were ready by the armistice. It was cancelled afterwards, with perhaps a dozen built by 1921.
We don't, unfortunately, have a medium Mark D in our collection, but this is a section of the snake track that was designed for it. It is connected by wires. Even after all these years, you can see it's full of oil, and it was designed to be flexible. Now, another design, the 7-ton light tank, achieved an astounding 30 miles an hour using this track. Unheard of for the time. Plan 1919 and the tank designs associated with it didn't survive the outbreak of peace, but the concepts remained an influence on future thinking going into the 1920s, 1930s. In the immediate post-war period, with peace and the dead hand of the Treasury resting pretty heavily on the War Office, the tank, having survived the traditionalists who write it off as an oddity of trench warfare, development continued, but at a rather slower pace. Now, for one thing, the Army Council couldn't decide what they wanted the tank corps to be, whether it's going to be a corps d'élite, a separate organisation, a branch of infantry and armour, or simply part of the Royal Engineers. Finally, in autumn 1922, the matter was settled. There would be a permanent tank corps of 4 battalions.
Meanwhile, tank and armoured car detachments were making themselves useful in Ireland during the War of Independence, during the occupation of the Rhineland, and in the policing of Britain's vast empire. Fuller, Captain Basil Liddell Hart and others continued to write and publish about the possibilities of mechanisation and mobility on the future battlefield, taking in, as designs became available, tanks, carriers, armoured cars and artillery.
Armoured cars demonstrated considerable possibilities for reconnaissance and raiding on the future battlefield, and the British Army fielded quite a number of designs. Demonstrating their sheer mobility and utility, the Ramadi Recce in Iraq in 1922, 16 vehicles in 17 days covered over 600 miles, being supplied by air and communicating by wireless. Now, that is quite remarkable for the time. This Lanchester 6-wheeler, which entered service in 1929, at 7 tons, is actually a bit big and heavy for reconnaissance. But it's got a 90 horsepower engine. It can do 45 miles an hour on the road, and it's got a range of around about 200 miles. Traversable turret has got a 0.5-inch and a .303 Vickers, and there's another Vickers down here next to the driver. This is the interior of the 1929 Lanchester armoured car. I've not been inside this before, so I'm quite excited. Two things strike you from the start. First, it's in incredibly good state, very, very complete. The second is how basic, how Spartan it is. It's based on a Lanchester motor car. So obviously the driver's controls, you've got steering wheel, gears, handbrake, pedals, just the same as for a Lanchester car. The floor itself, the decks, both here and at the back, are wooden, but then you've got a steel superstructure on top. The turret itself mounts a 0.303 inch Vickers and a 0.5 inch Vickers, and there would have been an optical sight, and there's a headrest here so you can actually operate that and use that. The turret traverse is manual. You crank it around by hand. And there's a feed system, so you've got a rack here for 2 ammunition boxes, because of course these are belt-fed guns, 250 round belts, and the belts actually come through a pair of brushes, which presumably take the muck off on the way through to the gun feed itself. Lanchester was actually a prestigious luxury car marque, and the story is told, it might be apocryphal, that Lanchester was chosen to persuade aristocratic cavalry officers, this vehicle is actually badged the 12th Lancers, that they wouldn't mind too much giving up their horses for armoured cars. This little vehicle is a Carden Lloyd carrier, and it's the forerunner of the universal carrier, which the British Army used quite a lot during World War II. Quite a few countries did actually use carriers. They're also called tankettes, and we have examples of the French Chenelette and the Italian Caraveloce. They were designed as machine gun platforms. They're also used for reconnaissance. Importantly, they were a lot cheaper to build than tanks. In fact, the prototype carrier was built by Major Gifford Lequain Martel in his garage out of spare parts.
This two-man design, the Mark VI, was built by Vickers between 1927 and 1930, and it's powered by a cheap and reliable Ford Model T car engine and armed with a .303 inch Vickers machine gun.
Probably the best tank of the period is this. It's the British Medium Mark II. In the turret, it's got an ordnance quick-firing 3-pounder gun, coaxial machine gun, and 2 further Vickers guns in ball mounts in the hull. It's also the first British tank to have a fully traversable turret and sprung suspension.
Powered by 90 horsepower Armstrong Siddeley V8 engine, the Medium Mark II can do 15 miles an hour on the road. A bit underpowered and lightly armoured, but a very capable tank for the period. We don't have any of the artillery of the period, but the Birch gun, a self-propelled field gun, consisted of an 18-pounder mounted on the chassis of a Medium Mark II. And the Dragon tractor, used as an artillery prime mover, was also derived from the Vickers medium design. By the mid-1920s, mechanisation of the army had started to catch the public imagination. As we can see from this postcard, showing an old lady prodding a tank corps soldier with her umbrella with the question, "Young man, what's this mechanisation we hear so much about?" The apostles of tank warfare, particularly Fuller and Liddell Hart, but also Martel and Hobart, he of Hobo's Funnies fame, probably weren't doing themselves many favours by suggesting that tanks and AFVs would rule the future battlefield, making cavalry and even infantry redundant. In 1927, the decision was finally taken to form an experimental mechanised force to test the possibilities in large-scale exercises.
Fuller was offered command of the new unit, but he declined huffily because his responsibilities would have included command of the Tidworth garrison, where the EMF was going to be based. In the end, the Chief of Imperial General Staff, General Milne, pushed ahead, and the result was a more balanced combined arms formation than Fuller would perhaps have wanted.
The modern and innovative nature of the EMF is summed up to me by this air photograph. It shows the force in review order: tanks, carriers, Citroën Kegres half-tracks, towed artillery, even a bridging unit. It's not Fuller's pure tank ideal, the half-tracks do carry infantry, but it's what we, in modern terms, would call a battle group.
The first real test of the EMF's capabilities were the 1927 Eastland versus Westland manoeuvres. Now, these were large-scale manoeuvres carried out across big swathes of southern England, and they pitted a fictitious Eastland force, which was the EMF's 2 armoured battalions with RAF support, against a Westland force, the enemy, which was a mixed infantry and cavalry formation, again with air support.
The result was mixed. The EMF Recce Group was able to capture critical bridges over a river, allowing the force to advance and flank the enemy, but a breakdown in comms caused confusion, and some of the Westland units were able to outmanoeuvre the EMF and reach their objectives. The EMF was also criticised for failing to organise fire support before attacks.
Having more or less served its purpose, the EMF was shut down at the end of 1928. There was then a pause for study, and a tank brigade was formed in 1931, which becomes permanent in 1934. The brigade was composed of medium tanks and tankettes under the command of Brigadier PCS Hobart. That was later combined with a brigade of infantry and another of field artillery under Major General Lindsay, and is renamed the Mobile Force.
In an exercise which became nicknamed the Battle of Beresford Bridge, the Mobile Force suffered fallouts between Lindsay and Hobart, lost a crucial element of surprise, and was judged to have been forced to retreat through air attack. Against this, it had demonstrated good mobility and flanked the enemy force.
The idea that a fast-moving, well-directed mobile force could defeat conventional forces on the battlefield was gaining ground. The new CIGS, Field Marshal Sir Archibald Montgomery Massingbird, ordered the formation of a mobile division. This was to be based in Egypt, and it would form the core of 7th Armoured Division, the famed Desert Rats of World War II. As the 30s wore on, 2 things became evident. One is that the horse had no place on the future battlefield, and 2 was that a major European war was imminent. In the remarkably prescient 1935 General Staff document, Forecast of the Early Stages of War with Germany, the German army was believed to be planning a rapid strike by an elite force, ending the war by driving straight into the enemy's heartland.
The French, meantime, having built the Maginot Line, were planning on a defensive war, preferably fought in Belgium, to avoid the destruction to French territory seen in World War I. Britain was still intending to send a mixed infantry and mobile force to block any German advance.
The problem was that British tank design, previously the best in the world, had lost its way. I mean, the 1930s are a story of failed designs. There's a lot of confusion in the army about priorities, about what sort of tanks they actually wanted. Restricted budgets and a very low priority for industrial resources. Now, the result of that is the army enters World War II with a mix of poor light tanks, slow-moving infantry tanks, and cruisers, which are frankly just dreadful. They are badly designed and they are poorly armoured. This A9 cruiser tank has a 2-pounder gun in the turret. It's got a coaxial Vickers gun alongside. That's fairly normal. But then you come to the front of the tank and you've got this peculiar arrangement. 2 extra small turrets, and the crew tend to refer to them as dustbins, with Vickers guns in, a square box for the driver, and what that does, it turns the whole front of the tank into a great mass of shot traps all over the place. It is pretty thinly armoured. It's been between 6 and 14 mil. And the 2-pounder gun, although it's quite good, it's high velocity, fires solid shot, it's quite good against tanks, it doesn't fire a worthwhile high explosive round. This was a time of constrained finances. This is a tank that was built for a price, and I'm afraid it rather shows. And if you add into that the fact that the main air element designed to support ground operations, the Advanced Air Striking Force, it comprises obsolete types like Blenheim Wands and Fairy Battles. It's a recipe for disaster. This aside, in 1939-40, the British Army is one of the most mechanised in the world. Far less horse transport than, say, the German Army. But the big problem is that we are the minor player. The British Army is wedded to a French defensive strategy, which is based on an advance into Belgium up to a defensive line on the River Dyle. When this was upstaged by a rapid German armoured thrust through the Ardennes, the Anglo-French defensive strategy just simply implodes. Unfortunately, Fuller's lessons, rapid armoured thrusts supported by aircraft, which had been trialled by the EMF, had been better learned elsewhere.
To anyone who doubts his influence on the development of the Panzerwaffe, Guderian had paid his own money to have Fuller's book, Provisional Instructions in Tank and Armoured Car Training, translated into German. The German General Staff, here we see General von Blomberg, also frequent and enthusiastic observers at EMF exercises.
We know this isn't the whole story. Blitzkrieg is a fusion of British ideas and Soviet deep battle, along with German concepts of manoeuvre, warfare and concentration of force. It's almost, and this is a massive oversimplification, as though the tactical element is British and the strategic Soviet, backed up by the traditional German need to fight a war on two fronts.
Major General Boney Fuller was an odd man in many ways. He was a Satanist and a follower of the notorious Aleister Crowley, the evilest man in Britain. He was also a leading member of the British Union of Fascists and narrowly escaped internment in 1939.
Perhaps he should have the last word. On viewing the resurgent Wehrmacht's first armoured manoeuvres in 1935, Fuller was asked by Hitler, "Well, what do you think of your children?"
His reply was, "Excellency, they've grown up so fast, I hardly recognise them." Fuller's thinking and the British Army's experimentation would bear fruit in 1940, but sadly not for the British Army. Using armour, motorised infantry, artillery, air support and well thought out logistics, the Panzer Division smashed deep into France. 7th Panzer, Rommel's Ghost Division that we mentioned before, covered over 100 miles in 10 days.
It's not down to superior equipment. I mean, tanks like this, Panzer II, a lot of them around in 1940, thin armour, 2-centimetre gun. Even tanks like the Panzer III, the Czech-made Panzer 38T, they're inferior to a lot of the French armour that is facing them. What it is down to is speed, surprise, and the massive concentration of force. Enemy strongpoints are bypassed, left behind for the conventional forces following up. The Stukas, Ju-87s, act as aerial artillery, blast the opposition. The enemy was unbalanced and had no response. This is the realisation of Fuller's ideas.
In the search for a solution on how to fight mechanised war, the British Army's theorists, Fuller, Liddell, Hart, Martel, Hobart and the rest, built on the lessons of the last months of World War I, the combined arms action. These were modified and developed to take into account improving technology in tanks, armoured fighting vehicles and aircraft. Despite opposition from the traditionalists, a new tactical thinking evolved, centring, sometimes perhaps too much so, on the tank. The experimental mechanised force, later the mobile force, tested these theories in large-scale exercises, attracting international attention. Constraints on the War Office budget in the 1930s limited full development, but the ideas of Fuller were hugely influential elsewhere.
Consequently, in the early summer of 1940, France falls in just 6 weeks to a reinvigorated German army. Thanks for watching. We hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like, subscribe, and if you can, support us on Patreon.